this computer. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to, I guess, the beginning of year 7 of Popular Music Books in Process, which started in the COVID year 2020. Um, Back then, we were a co-production of Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference. Now we're kind of a beast unto ourselves, but we motor on just like indie rock, event after event, just like band after band. And so this is a great way to begin today, the new year, with a look at indie rock in the 2010s. Chris DeVille's book, let me see if it's visible, Such Great Heights, the complete cultural history of the indie rock explosion, with about 20 bands on the advanced review copy from Iron and Wine to Mitski. And Chris will be talking with Grace Robins-Somerville. Um, and I should just tell you real quick a little about both of them. Chris is the managing editor of Stereogum, the music blog. He's written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Ringer, Rolling Stone, Washington Post, The Verge. He's managed to keep doing this in the hardest of times. He's been on podcasts like Bandsplain and It's Been a Minute, and comes to us, I believe, from Ohio.
That's
Um,
right.
Excellent. Welcome, Chris. And he'll be in conversation with Grace Robins-Somerville, who moved back to her hometown of Brooklyn after getting an MFA from the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. Her work uh, is in uh, Paste, Pitchfork, Stereogum, Antics, has a Substack, Our Band Could Be Your Wife, referencing another important music book, a newsletter mostly about music. She writes about obsession and nostalgia, two things both constantly ruining and saving her life. We'll have plenty of time for the participants on this chat to ask questions at the end, but you're free throughout the event to post in the chat both questions, sort of bookmarking a spot, but also comments, which we'll share with Chris and Grace when the event is done. I should quickly note that next week, newly added to our printed lineup, um, we have Bad Bunny book under discussion, January 14th. Vanessa Diaz and Petra Rivera Rideau. P fucking R, how Bad Bunny became the global voice of Puerto Rican resistance in conversation with NPR Music's Anna Maria Sayre. So um, that is everything on this end. Welcome, Chris. Welcome, Grace. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Eric.
I am Chris DeVille, and my book is Such Great Heights. So the idea for this book is basically tracing the cultural entity known as indie over the course of the last 25 years or so. I felt like there were books that were telling the history of indie rock in its early years. You know, we already have had a reference to Our Band Could Be Your Life. There's the Yola Tango biography that kind of maps out the early years of indie rock and how it came to be a scene and a genre. And there's some other important texts. And I felt like we were starting to see books about the 2000s, like Meet Me in the Bathroom. But I felt like the early 2010s were kind of coming to a point where we were far enough away where we could do some analysis. And in order to get there, I wanted to look back across the whole 2000s. Um, so basically, the idea was I around the time I started working at Stereogum, which was 2013, the concept of indie was so different. Whether you're talking about indie as a business practice or as a musical genre, or how many types of how many types of music are included under the umbrella of indie. Uh, the whole cultural entity had changed so much. The cultural context around it had changed so much. A lot of the stuff that was considered like core indie rock at the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, uh, the audience that had been rallying around that stuff, I found was, seemingly racing away from everything, like racing away from rock towards seemingly every other genre. And so I wanted to figure out, kind of go back and map out some of the developments that led to that evolution. And, some of them are technological, some of them are pop cultural, talking about the ways that indie rock impacted fashion and Hollywood productions, and some of them were certainly critical and philosophical. Um, and so the idea, my original subtitle for the book was How Indie Rock Went Pop, and I meant that in the sense, both the sense of like breaking through to a mainstream audience, as well as sort of morphing into a type of pop music over the years. We changed the title to The Complete Cultural History of the Indie Rock Explosion sometime after I finished writing the book. And so it's like, I know it's not complete. It can never be complete. But that is sort of the gist of what I was trying to get at. I was trying to go all the way from basically my entry point into the world of indie rock, which was, around the year 2000, 2001, kind of that, 9/11 moment, and take it all the way to the point where even a Taylor Swift album could be described as indie because of the aesthetic that she was going for and the people she worked with on it. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different stops along the way, and some things I covered in more depth than others, but that is the basic gist of it. So I don't know if Grace wants to hop in now and start conversing.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. Since you mentioned starting this book with um, a personal history and talking about bands or other like cultural institutions that were gateways into the world of indie rock for you, that were kind of skeleton keys. I'm thinking the way you talk about bands like Radiohead or sites like Pitchfork. Um, I feel like every generation has a lot of artists that, maybe not a lot, but has artists that serve a similar purpose for young people, where like this artist or even this music publication is a a point of entry into piquing someone's interest in the world of independent music. I'd say that like on the music journalism side of things, Stereogum is definitely one of these for a lot of listeners and readers. And I'm curious, what qualities do you think give a certain band or publication that ambassador status? And what bands or publications of today do you think have that?
Ooh, man, you coming in with a hard one right away. It, I mean, from certainly my book is very pitchfork centric, just because of the nature of what it's covering, and I think the version of Pitchfork that I got, kind of introduced to indie rock through was, I think they had a lot of authority, partially because they kind of staked out their territory online early, and partially because they wrote with kind of this give no fucks attitude, where they had very strong opinions. They were doling out 10.0s and 0.0s, and they were kind of crafting this canon, and the recommendations were good a lot of the time. So for a lot of people, they became this trusted source. And there was there was a brain dead kind of following the flock aspect to some of it, where it was like, sort of a snake eating its tail of, if Pitchfork recommends it, then, it must be good for a certain segment of the audience, or if Pitchfork hates it, it must be bad. Um, but yeah, I think they were able to build that clout, um, by, actually saying something, not just being like sort of a content aggregator, not just feeling like they had to comment on every single thing. They had a very focused, that's one of the things that changed over time. And it's changed with Stereogum too. It's changed with a lot of places. It's like you start with kind of a focused, there's we're trying to focus on a particular set of artists and a particular set of scenes, and we're going to ignore what's happening in the mainstream, and we're going to ignore huge swaths of the world. And so I think that that was to their benefit at the time because they were like, they were honing in on the things that they cared about and the things that they felt were important. And it had kind of the fanzine-ish passion behind it that was easy to rally behind. And then so, a lot of the bands that they started throwing their support behind were playing a version of indie rock that was very easy for a lot of people to rally behind. It was very accessible, uh, very, anthemic, whether we're talking about Arcade Fire or Sufjan or I mean, there's so many. We know all the 2000s Pitchfork bands, but so yeah, that was kind of like that was kind of how it worked for me at the time. As to what is the current equivalent of that, I feel like a lot of I don't know where all of that is happening now. Like the internet feels so much more stratified to me. Media feels so much more stratified to me than it did. I mean, there's certainly Fantano, and he commands a big audience still. Um, and certainly Pitchfork still pulls some weight. I don't think that it's necessarily wielding the same influence that it did 10 or 15 years ago. But certainly, if they come out swinging, I mean, you yourself have written a pitchfork pan that reverberated through the internet. So, I think that that still matters. I just feel like a lot of what's, influencing the the discourse or what's helping not even influencing the discourse like the thing that's creating actual new fans. I don't know if it is even necessarily in the written word. Like I'm guessing that like it's podcasts and Discord servers and uh you know, TikTokers and it's just like I'm such a native creature of like websites that are posting reviews and interviews and news and like Stereogum's kind of a dinosaur in that sense that we're still operating in that way. And we're lucky enough to have like an audience that still wants that. But I feel like I don't know. I certainly wouldn't put us as like, a kingmaker or something like that today. So, I don't know who the kingmakers are. Do you have any thoughts about that yourself?
I mean, I think that you named a lot of them, like Fantano, and I think in general, a lot of the critics that I have seen grow their following, and especially their like younger following in recent years, are ones who are doing like the front-facing video
Mm-hmm.
style review, or like um, people like Margot Labat,
Mm-hmm.
Marg MP3.
Marg MP3.
Yeah, she does a lot of like, here are 10 great albums from this month that might have flown under your radar, things like that. And I think part of that is just like the general pivot to vertical video where there's more availability for that and also more demand for it
Mm-hmm.
than for like medium or long form written criticism. I would say also like a lot of I think like r slash mu or rate your music, like a lot of people are probably getting into indie rock by just going to websites like those and looking
Yeah.
at like, okay, what are the like essential rock albums I need to listen to? Um, and those are kind of these gateways. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about specific artists who serve a similar purpose. You have this really great like defensive, almost derivative music At one point in this book where you talk about how like listening to The Strokes and Interpol was what prompted you to go back and dig into the discographies of like the Velvet Underground and Joy Division. Um, and I would love to and you kind of theorize towards the end of the book as well about like, oh, are there people who are getting into Silver Jews because they're listening to Wednesday and MJ Lenderman? Are there people who are checking out The Breeders and Liz Phair because they're listening to Mama? And I'm curious what kind of balance you think a band needs to strike to be a sort of ambassador or gateway band, in terms of like derivative versus original, or like accessible versus experimental.
Yeah, it feels like you can't just be entirely derivative in order to achieve that sort of generational band status. I like the term ambassador that you used. Like, I mean, I hate to just make everything about geese like everybody else, but like
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's interesting about all of the clamor around geese is that it's like you can, if you want to play spot the influences, there are so many influences to
Mhm.
spot. Like they clearly are students of music history, and they clearly love. You can tell some of the music that they love based on what they're making, and the people who are more inclined to dismiss them really want to lean on like, oh, it's just X band or it's
Yeah.
Y band,
Just
it's Z
Radiohead
band.
for Zoomers, etc.
Yeah, yeah, or Rufus Wainwright
Hmm.
or like there, I mean, there the list goes on. It's actually like I think it speaks to the quality of what they're doing that like so many people hear so many different things in the music, but like I think they've been able to combine all of those influences into something that is like, first of all, they've got songs. Like that's the thing with the Strokes. They had songs.
Hmm.
And so like I I was 17, 18 when I was getting into the Strokes, so I wasn't jaded enough to be like, "Oh, they just sound like the Velvet Underground and
Hmm.
television." Like I when people would scoff at them like that, I would just be like, "Well, too bad. Like I love their songs."
Yeah.
And so like I kind of feel the same way about Geese now, where it's like I love their songs and they're they're taking all these ingredients. You can see that you can maybe see the recipe, but like it's still good even if you can see the recipe.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a huge part of it is like you have to have actually like brilliant songs, brilliant performances, and you probably need some sort of non-musical factors as well. There's like an aspect of coalition building where it's like uh I mean Wednesday too, it's like they were pulling from country and from grunge and from shoegaze and from all these different corners of music history, but they were also like kind of representing the South, and they were this like the they kind of stood for a geographical scene, which is also true of Geese. Geese is like an important New York rock band. So. I think so. Those are some of the factors. It helps if they're like not so, you want them to be accessible like in a way where someone who is not maybe majorly tapped into new music can get on board with them and
Hmm.
get excited about them. But at the same time, like not so like anodyne that kind of like what I was talking about with publications, like they have to stand for something. They have to like have some kind of substance to them that is their own. It's not they can't just be like, a cardboard cutout of a band.
Hmm. I I'm glad that we've come to Geese and Wednesday because I've been thinking about this a lot while rereading your book because a lot of what you do here is track the shift in emphasis in indie rock from bands to solo artists.
Mm,
It felt like from 2015 till like almost a year or two ago, the biggest indie artists were soloists. And
yes.
I consider the period of like Boy Genius putting out their big, very critically and commercially successful album, and also that period of Cameron Winter and MJ Lenderman putting out very critically acclaimed solo records while also being attached to very critically well received bands, and kind of like boosting, having the solo careers boost their band's career as well. I consider that to be sort of like a bridge era.
Mm.
And I am sort of foreseeing this pendulum swing back towards people caring about bands and people wanting to start bands. And I think, like, especially coming out of the COVID era, it makes so much sense that that was an era where the main characteristic of indie rock was people alone in their rooms making music for other people alone in their rooms. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on these kind of pendulum swings towards and away from like the band versus the soloist, and um, if you have any thoughts about what that might be indicative of in a larger cultural scheme.
Yeah, I think it part of the shift that we're seeing is related to, I think, I mean, you're not wrong about like coming out of COVID, like people want to connect. Um, I certainly got sick of seeing like one person performing in front of a screen. The idea that like you can get more than one person together and they can, create music together. Um, but like I feel like we're kind of seeing an appetite, like an audience is there for sort of not necessarily rejecting the idea of like indie pop stars, the indie rock as a solo artist medium. Like, I mean, obviously, like there's still an audience for like Clairo,
Mhm.
um, and Caroline Polachek. Like, these are some of the artists that were like kind of coming out of the sort of indie world and becoming pop stars.
I would
Yeah,
also argue, though, that both of them are like super frequent collaborators.
yeah, yeah. I guess so. It, I didn't really get to go deep into this at the end of the book just because like the last chapter basically had to collapse, almost a decade of history into like one chapter because I ran out of book. Um, but like I think there's a lot to think about with regards to like kind of how, in the early 2010s we had the kind of like Tumblr pop stars. We had Sky Ferreira and Charlie XCX and Grimes and Lana Del Rey, and they were kind of emerging within this same indie ecosystem that had been supporting indie rock. And we had, the blog rap kind of over overlapping with the indie rock and sort of the all of the indie rock listeners getting really into Kanye and Drake and Kendrick Lamar and sort of the rise of Run the Jewels, and you had the same thing happening with indie and R&B, and certainly a lot of there was some overlap with what was happening in EDM at the time too, and a lot of like there was just such a boom within the indie, quote unquote, indie ecosystem for like non-rock things. And then I feel like some of the bands, some of the indie artists that were sort of reaching for pop stardom, I feel like kind of hit a wall in the mid 2010s. And some of them were able to get over it eventually, due to, with Mitski's case, it was like TikTok. Um, but like the late what I'm trying to get to is that in the late 2010s, I feel like we ended on this sort of Jack Antonoff-ish, like smoothed out hybrid of indie and pop. where it's like very streaming friendly. Um, like even a lot of the really critically acclaimed stuff, a lot of the stuff that I loved, uh, it was like there was sort of a smoothness to it, an easy listening quality to it. And I feel like what we're seeing now with some of the biggest bands that are blowing up is sort of a rejection of that smoothness and the easy listening quality to it. Like, I mean, we've been talking about Geese and Wednesday. These are bands that are, they keep the rough edges and they don't sing in, conventional ways. Like, certainly Cameron Winter's voice, he does all kinds of bizarre things with it. And, Carly Hartzman, she sings sweetly, but then she also screams and like she doesn't feel the need to like tone it down to try to reach a larger audience. I think that so like I sense that you can even maybe make the case that the whole like windmill scene and the London, everything that's come out of London since like late 2010s and throughout the 2020s, there is this movement away from like sort of indie as pop
Hmm.
and back towards like a little bit more combustible, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more like in touch with rock.
Yeah, I'd
And
say something similar about like the Hallow Gallows scene in
hmm
Chicago
yeah.
that like Horse Girl and Sharp Pins and Lifeguard have all come out of. But almost in an opposite direction where they're kind of like distilling pop down to its barest
Mm.
essentials and like making that the new face of like a youth rock movement.
And they're an interesting one because they're like going back, like they're sort of directly pulling from 80s and 90s
Hmm.
in a way. Like it's interesting. I don't see many people giving them the like Strokes and Interpol type criticism of like, oh, they're just regurgitating these
Hmm.
cool old records from 20, 30, 40 years ago. Uh, and maybe that's because they're not doing it with this like ultra professional sheen, or you can tell they really love it. I don't know what the difference is there, but like that to me, it feels like they're almost just like rejecting the last like 20 years of music history and just like we want to go back to a purer time or something.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely felt that way about like the Horse Girl record from this year where it felt very there was something very primitive about it that reminded me of like the Slits or like Shop Assistants or something like that. And I feel like this is a good segue into something I wanted to talk about, which is the tension between aesthetics and ethics in this book.
Mm.
You wrote that you got into indie music not because of some pull towards like DIY politics, but because you felt like connected to the way the music sounded and the way it made you feel. And I feel like a lot of this book tracks not just music trends, but the ways in which musicians and listeners signal their associations with certain subcultures or aesthetics or political ideologies or scenes, and the way that signaling has evolved over the years. And I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about like what aspects of this you felt are or used to be characteristic of indie rock and what has kind of trickled up to the mainstream.
Yeah, so like it's true. I feel like sometimes I feel like I represent like the gentrifier of indie rock. Like I ended up involved in my local music scene, like sort of backed into it when I was in college just because I wanted to have a band and like so I got excited about going to see local bands and and then I ended up writing about my local music scene for several years in Columbus when I worked for Columbus Alive. But yeah, when I first got into it, it was definitely like through the internet in a way that didn't require any sort of engagement with uh, a community, any sort of engagement with ideals. And I think that, that was a lot of people's entry point, and that contributed to the like the softening of the edges of it in the first place. Like I cite a article by my Stereogum coworker Tom Bryan from back when he was at the Village Voice, where it was like the Shins ruined indie rock, and he was making the case that since the barrier to entry had become so low, you didn't have to be going to local shows, you didn't have to be tracking down zines, you didn't have to be at the record store, you could just be on your computer pirating a bunch of music, and maybe you were hearing it on the OC or whatever. It allowed the music to become a little bit more passive and a little bit more of a lifestyle product. And so, yeah, I think I have to consider myself somewhat as a guilty party in that, just because of the way that I engaged with it for so long. And I do think that when underground music was when these networks were developing, uh, you know, of you can go to this town and you can play these venues and you can stay at these houses, and these record labels were starting to spring up. I mean, certainly it was not without corruption. Like, I mean, uh, if you read Our Band Could Be Your Life, you certainly see examples of like bands getting screwed over by their record labels. Um, so it's not like it was like some pure utopian culture, and it wasn't like, I wasn't there in the 80s, so I don't know how like uh what the gender politics totally of everything were when that whole world was coming to be. But I think, yeah, this it was interesting. The aesthetics and the style of indie trickled out into the world. I'm not sure that the ethics of it really did, and I think some of that is because the ethics within that world seemed to kind of change or at least evolve. Like certainly around the idea of selling out, uh, that was one of the things I tried to trace in the book. Is like why did this kind of subculture that was so averse to the idea of selling out soften its stance, or at least some parts of that culture soften their stance. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that. I do think it was interesting when I was reading, um, what's his name? Spencer Kornhaber from The Atlantic, when he wrote about the book, he was talking about some of the ways that like sort of an indie mentality has infiltrated pop culture. And it was some stuff that I didn't really think to touch on in the book. Uh, but to me, it feels like, the image associated and the aesthetic associated with indie, which has, itself changed so much. That is what I see really making its imprint on pop culture, less so than whatever kind of, progressive ideals.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought up the topic of selling out because that's what I wanted to talk about next. I wanted to kind of fold that in with a discussion of a big chunk of this book is talking about how the role that music supervision played
Mm,
in the spread of indie to the mainstream. You talk about TV shows like The OC or movies like Juno and 500 Days of Summer. And kind of just these all of these avenues for like middle brow forced exposure to alternative music. And like before that there was like TRL and that was kind of like this last gasp of MTV's cultural dominance. And now I feel like when we see like an indie rock song, I'm using the term indie rock very loosely, getting a lot of mainstream exposure via television or film, it's usually an older one. I'm thinking about like a recent example is like a Wolf Parade song being featured in an episode of Heated Rivalry, or like when Stranger Things had Running Up That Hill. feature very prominently in the show, and it brought that song into the American Billboard Hot 100 like over 30 years after it first dropped. Um, and or not over 30 years, almost 30 years, but um, I was also kind of thinking about television versus commercials, where
Mm.
um, you have this one example of like an artist like Feist being introduced to the masses through a sync for an iPod commercial, but like at the same time, she maintained her indie credibility as opposed to a band like Jet, who had a similar brand partnership, I believe, like also iPod commercial. Not to bring it back to a place of geese, but like a modern example of this might be something like Cameron Winter covering Dancing in the Dark for an Xbox commercial. And like he is still someone who has maintained indie credibility. And like the people who were clowning on that, I feel like were people who were already not on board. Um, but I would love to kind of hear your take on like, is there a certain amount of critical goodwill that an artist has to bank in order to avoid the sellout accusations or like in order to earn their right to sell out or buy in? Um, and yeah, just kind of like how has these concepts like selling out evolved since the beginning of the 21st century?
Well, it's interesting that you compare Jet versus Feist and sort of like it was like I mean we're when we're talking about this we're inevitably talking about Pitchfork again, um, just because they're the ones who sort of like canonized the idea of Jet as this like blight on music. And I there was a piece about Feist that I quoted by Ryan Domble. I quoted in the book where he's talking about like basically pinching his nose to like, yeah, it might sound like biscotti Starbucks music, but like it's actually good. Um, and it's sort of like Feist was on the good team and Jet was on the bad team, and like so Jet doing the Apple commercial. Uh, it could be used as an example of how they're horrible sellouts, but I feel like it was more just like that. I'm not sure how much the fact that Jet was in that Apple commercial was like the driver behind this critical ill will towards them. It's possible that that was a factor that I was kind of missing. I mean, I was in college at the time, and I was certainly reading the critics, but I wasn't necessarily writing the criticism at the time. Um,
Did you like Jet?
No, but I mean, actually, and you know this from the book, but like my bandmate at the time wrote a song that was like making fun of Jet.
Yeah.
It was like a Strokes style pastiche called "Here Comes the Warm Jet."
Oh, that was so funny.
You can find it on your favorite streaming service. Two different versions of it, in fact, the EP version and the album version. Um, but no, and I think that part of the reason I didn't like them, to my shame, was that like Pitchfork told me not to like them. Uh, but I do, I can go back now with my 20 years later ears, and I can hear the difference, the subtle difference between what they were doing and some of the more critically acclaimed bands. Like it does. I described it as like it sounds like Lust for Life playing in a frat house, and but I don't think that like your average listener who's not like who's someone who's not super clued into all the scene politics and the nuances of music history, I can see why they wouldn't sense much of a difference between the White Stripes and Jet.
Yeah.
Um, so, but it's interesting, yeah, that your idea that like you have to bank a certain amount of critical cachet and then it's okay for you to sell out. I mean, I think that's probably not the way that it was in the 90s, but it
Hmm.
sort of became that way in the 2000s. Yeah, Feist was like she was part of Broken Social Scene, and she was on yeah, she had critically acclaimed solo albums even before she did the whole Apple thing. And she was doing really well for herself even before the Apple thing. Like that certainly took her to a different level.
Yeah.
Um,
I yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of it is also just there are less opportunities for artists to make a living from like just touring and selling records. So like when I hear like a Rat Boys song in a Walmart commercial or like a McKinley Dixon song in a commercial for Capital One Bank, I'm like, well, these people probably didn't go into the studio thinking, okay, like I need to write the perfect song to get this commercial sync. Like their dream was probably not to be in a commercial for Walmart or for a bank, but like it's just the thing they have to do to get the money to survive. And like, as you
yeah, I
have
mean,
fewer options to not sell out, the stigma around selling out kind of dies down.
yeah, I think that there is that was part of it for sure was the idea that like it is harder to make a living
Mhm.
making music now. The way that the sort of music industry has evolved, it's made it very difficult for everyone except for the 1%
Mhm.
to profit. And so that was, that was becoming true, maybe like I think it's 2013. I don't remember what year was the Jessica Hopper BuzzFeed article that I talk about in the book where she was with Tegan and Sarah at the
Mhm.
ad agency while they were, playing their music for ad execs trying to get syncs. But it's like, that was already kind of becoming the reality at that point in time. And so there was sort of like the economic reality where like, can these bands afford to be so pure anymore? But I feel like uh, it's probably entangled with the whole poptimism thing as well. Uh, like, because part of selling out was like signing to a major label, being on the radio, being on MTV. Like, there were different
Mhm.
degrees of selling out, I guess, and certainly being in commercials was a part of it. Um, but like, yeah, I think that sort of reorienting towards like, well, a lot of this music that we viewed as like the enemy before, maybe we should reconsider it. Maybe we should engage with it. Maybe we're like walling ourselves off and being a little bit insular. Maybe we're being elitist. Maybe some of the critical biases that we've been wielding are related to other biases
Mhm.
that are like more insidious. All of that was kind of in the mix. That definitely affected the way that the sound of indie evolved as it became more eclectic, and certainly that was more convenient for any artists that wanted to have sort of a careerist mindset within the indie world. So it's a very complicated thing, like the idea of selling out and how the attitudes around it have changed. But yeah, I tried to hit on some of the different reasons in the book.
Mhm. I had like two more questions that I wanted to ask. Do you have time for that, Eric? Is that cool? Okay, awesome. I'm getting a thumbs up. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a subject you touched on and one that is very near and dear to my heart, the phenomenon of the your favorite band's favorite band, um, and how that kind of changes from era to era and from scene to scene. You kind of talk about the big examples like the Velvet Underground or Captain Beefheart. When I was like growing up and reading like first reading like Punk News and Brooklyn Vegan and Hard Times, I feel like that was the label that would go to like bomb the music industry or the sidekicks. And just as recently as like 2 or 3 years ago, even more recent, um, Chapel Roan was coined your favorite artist's favorite artist, and that label was one that was very prevalent as she was seeing this very rapid ascent from kind of like niche alt pop star to like chart topper, A-lister, headlining festivals. And I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on like the art of the cosign and how the your favorite artist phenomenon has evolved.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like that's one of the best ways now for an artist to break is like by collaborating with a bigger artist. Um, I'm sure that that was a phenomenon 40 years ago, but it feels like it's so much harder to break through the noise now, just because there's so much more music. It's just all so instantly available, and the media infrastructure that's there to get the word out about the different music has decayed so much. So it's like being able to be associated with someone who has a foothold in the music world. I feel like it counts for a lot. I mean, I feel like, mm, no, I'm not going to go down that road. Yeah, I think that it continues to be super important. I think even just like this is a tale as old as time, but like which bands get to go out on tour with the bigger bands still makes a huge difference. And that was certainly true of the Chapel Roan thing. She was opening for Olivia Rodrigo right before she blew up. Um, so
It
like,
was interesting that the openers on that tour, it was her who was this up and coming pop star, and the Breeders who were like,
right.
these kind of elder states people. And I love the idea that some teenage girl somewhere is getting into the Breeders because she saw them open for Olivia Rodrigo.
Yeah, it's amazing. Uh, and I do think that like we are still seeing that to some extent. Like, I mean, Lenderman is a good example where he's become such a huge deal, and I think that that has provided a brighter spotlight on some of the artists who are associated with him, whether it be, other people from Asheville or whether it be like, I've developed a pretty strong interest in Dear Life Records, which put out boat songs and is run by people from the band Friendship. And like I feel like I was a lot more tuned in to the last year's Friendship album because of the association with MJ Lenderman.
Mhm.
And so like I mean, I feel like it might just be because the Friendship album was incredible, but I feel like they really ascended to a new level of prominence with this album cycle, and I do think that it's connected to like them sort of being within the vicinity of MJ Lenderman. It has something to do with it. So I think it still matters a lot.
Definitely. Um, Finally, I would love to talk about kind of jump off of the 2015 Vice feature that you discussed in this book. Is titled How Did the Hipster Become Mainstream? And it
Mm,
kind of argued that the hipster archetype's obsession with self-documenting and self-archiving was ultimately what killed its exclusivity and killed the alternativeness of that archetype. And now with the ubiquity of TikTok and Instagram, that kind of self-documentation has never been more accessible. And there's never been more of an incentive to self-document and kind of for anyone to turn their life into an object of cultural fascination. And also the trend cycles have never been shorter.
mhm.
Um, and I'm interested in like how big an artist or trend or subculture has to be to no longer be considered alternative, and like really where do we go from here? And like how do we even separate like uh indulgent versus artful self-documentation?
Ooh, yeah. I the self-documentation part of it is I'd be fascinated to hear what you have to say about that, but I think that the idea of um, hipster signifiers going out I mean, that's just there's always this upward flow from the underground to mainstream, from subculture to culture, right? So the the whole breakthrough that I'm talking about in this book, it's certain obviously it's not the first time that like alternative music has shot up into the mainstream. Like, I mean, it's not the first time that alternative music has morphed into pop music. You know, you can go back to Blondie, and certainly you can look at what happened a decade before the events of this book, like the 90s. Certainly there was like an underground music explosion into the mainstream that was arguably bigger.
Hmm.
And so I think that sort of what the book focused on was my particular generation's version of that. And yeah, the how did the hipster become mainstream kind of thing. It's like probably not so different than how the hippie became mainstream, like back in the 60s. Like it's once this archetype becomes a big enough deal that it can be like represented in media, it can be represented in film and TV, it can be represented in fashion. It's like then it can be sold. It's like, you know, we're talking about the conquest of cool. That's uh that is it does leave a question about like, you know, how long can this phenomenon, how long can any phenomenon continue to be considered an alternative phenomenon? And it's like the old compilation album says, alternative to what? And so, yeah, as far as like indie now, I feel like the word indie is maybe has maybe run its course. It might have become useless. Even like I've been wanting to write about this for like the book promo Substack. I was listening to Somber on Switched on Pop, the podcast,
Yeah.
and he's like he described his music as indie alternative, which is so funny.
Well, he's
But it's
like on a
like
major label and like has 50 million monthly listeners or whatever.
and I mean, it's like
And
it is pop music, but it's like you
yeah.
can hear the Strokes influence in it. You can hear the MGMT
Mhm.
influence in it. Like you can hear the stuff that was considered indie when he was growing up, like echoing through the music. Um, but it's like for a lot of listeners, maybe even a whole generation of listeners, like when they think indie, they think of something like Somber or like Role Model.
Mhm.
And it's like pretty far removed from the kind of stuff that gets celebrated on Stereogum or like whatever corner of like the indie, sort of the old guard indie ecosystem.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, and it's like I said, the fact that they called the Taylor Swift folklore album indie. All of us did. Like that's I didn't know what else to call it. It's like, oh, she made an album with Aaron Dessner, like, and Bon Iver's on it. Like, I guess this is her indie album. Uh, and so it's like there's there's probably got to become, and there usually is. There's probably got to become some sort of new terminology that sort of coalesces around a new wave, a new generation of artists that are, you know, doing something that's a little bit different from this thing that's been co-opted. Um, and I'm not sure exactly what the terminology is going to be, but it does kind of seem like the word indie, by the point, by the present, it's been wrung of all meaning.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the kind of circular lesson is just that like subculture has not necessarily died or, we've experienced the death of subculture thousands of times and will continue to and um, you know, subcultures will keep popping up and dying as new technologies also keep popping up and old ones become obsolete. But yeah, well, thank you so much, Chris. I think it's time to open it up to the Q&A.
Yeah,
We've got
sweet. Thanks.
we've got a lot of good questions. I'll kick things off with Tyler Sonicson, who has a question about the dismemberment plan.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't kidding about having one foot out the door. It's a snowstorm out here in Vermont right now. Also, my office is dark, so it looks like I have a ring light on me. So apologies for that, for those of you who are looking at me right now. Hi, Chris and Grace. This has been a really fun conversation. And I actually thought I always associate you with the dismemberment plan, Chris, because you use the emergency and I cover as your avatar
Yeah.
online. And I always think, the Dismemberment Plan were for me, they were a band I got into when I was in college around the time that they broke up in the early 2000s. And then I was living in DC when they became, at least in DC, the coolest thing in the world for like a weekend when they played the 930 Club and Black Cat. And there was so much like speculation about the plan, about how everyone was always lamenting about how they didn't get their due because they broke up before dance punk became huge in like 04, 05. But what was your take, or what was your takeaway, especially now that we're a decade removed? I know that they played Best Friends Forever Fest, but what's your like reflection on that now that we're like a decade plus removed of the, I mean, even the emo revival too, and a lot of stuff that happened in the early 2010s? Do you think that a lot of the bands that kind of got credit retroactively for what they accomplished in the 90s and early 2000s, do you think that they were given their adequate due, or Uncanny Valley's quality being as variable as it was? I'd just like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I did a interview with Travis like a year after panning Uncanny Valley, and then he found out that I was the guy who had panned it at Stereogum, and he was very grumpy for the rest of the interview. But yeah, I think getting their due, it's hard to define exactly what it means because it's like one of those bands where I feel like everyone who knows them like loves them, and maybe that wasn't the case during their heyday. I'm like you, I got into them like a couple of years before they broke up. I went to see them as many times as I could my freshman year of college, which happened to align with their last year of playing shows. Um, but like I also at the time when they were breaking up, this was like the height of me like immersing myself in like Pitchfork world and like allowing that to be the thing that shaped my taste. And so within that world, it was like Dismemberment Plan were a huge deal. Uh, and so to me, I didn't really like view them as like lesser than like the Rapture, even though like the Rapture like had a bigger commercial footprint probably. Now by the time we get to Franz Ferdinand a year later, then it's like okay, they really did kind of miss out, but I don't think I was even thinking about it at the time. Uh, I wasn't like, man, they really missed their window. It wasn't until I started reading, like writing the book, where I was like, wow, like they really preceded this whole dance punk thing. They were having dance parties on stage years before Girl Talk was inviting people to dance around him and his laptop. So I feel like they were definitely. I think most people recognize now like that they were pioneers and that they had a lot of great material. Most people who are sort of like tapped into indie rock history. I don't know if like your average 25-year-old knows who they are. I don't know if they're on the right like if their ranking at Rate Your Music is high enough or whatever like to for them to be canonized with the next generation. Um, I feel like if they were able to mount like a real tour, that it would do really well. But I know like that hasn't been in the cards for them. They've just been more like kind of weekend warriors when they reunite. Obviously, they couldn't do like the Death Cab Postal Service type reunion, but I think among people who are really like tapped into sort of indie rock history. They get their due. When it comes to like the broader society, certainly not. But like how many of these bands really do? Like, I mean, who from the 2000s do people even really think of anymore? Like there's just like a small handful of bands that people still like maybe have name recognition for. So like and I'm talking about when I say people, I mean like maybe your average music fan who just like had a few albums on their iPod that they downloaded on Napster and wasn't necessarily like faithfully reading album reviews. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. I just wanted to get your take now that, like I said, we've been, we're a decade past a lot of the, big reunions of the 90s wave bands.
It was really special to see them at Best Friends Forever and like be able to see them with like this massive crowd of people who all loved them. Like that was an experience. I mean, I went to their last show at the 930 Club in 2003, and so it was sort of like that. But the previous time I had seen them was at Coachella in 2014, and they were in this tent at midnight competing against like Nas and Muse and some electronic thing, maybe I don't know if it was Skrillex, but like the point is like nobody was in the tent. And so it was nice to like see them have a triumphant reunion moment.
Next
Thank
question
you.
is from Jamie Fisher, who has a question about transatlanticism.
Ooh,
Hi. So I've been working on a book about Elliott Smith, and
ooh.
I was talking to his A&R executive partly just about the story of what happened with Elliott and radio and not breaking through to radio. And he really remembered transatlanticism being this moment where the indie breakthrough happened, where
Hmm.
before there had been critical darlings who were not commercial successes. And transatlanticism really marked the moment where they started to just let these things be played on the airwaves. And I was wondering whether, is that a truism? Is that true? Is that, how if you, I don't know what your experience of it was working on the book.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to radio, I think that that was a breakthrough album. It's hard to separate it from the OC and like sort of that the OC was starting to hype up Death Cab for Cutie right at the time when Transatlanticism came out. And so they got this huge influx of fans who had no prior context for the world of indie rock. And so it built up to a point where it was like kind of undeniable. But at the same time, like I feel like they really dug in to the radio on their next album when they were signed to a major label. So I think that it's true that that was a watershed album in terms of like getting sort of an indie rock footprint back on alternative radio. Because yeah, I mean, we're talking about the bands that were getting played on alternative radio at that time were still a lot of the sort of post-grunge,
Yeah.
new metal. So like, yeah, it's hard to discount the importance of that album as sort of a generational touchstone, and that's one of the reasons why is because of the way that it was able to break through at radio.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sticking with Death Cab, Daniel Wagner has a question about reunion tours and anniversary shows.
Mm.
Hold on. Oh, there he goes. Okay. Hi. Really happy I ran into this at the very last minute last night and found out this existed. This has been awesome. Because I just finished the book like 4 hours ago.
Nice.
You kind of answered it with the dismemberment plan question, but it's a realization that we've finally gotten old when all of our favorite bands are doing these reunion tours and playing like, oh, it's the 25th anniversary of this album. And I'm like, shit, dude, like it's 25 years. And like I went and saw the Death Cab and Death Cab and Postal Service shows. I saw it in Detroit and Columbus. Was amazing. Best experiences. But I saw Spoon later this year, and it was very much a cash grab. You could tell, like it's just, I don't want to do this. So I think my question really is this really for the best? Like I get that now we all have disposable income that we may not have had back then. And for someone like me that's from Alabama, these bands didn't come around me. So these are my first opportunities really to see them. Or should we just let our memories be what we had? That actually ties into a second really quick one of I'm going to All Your Friends on next week, which is this touring indie rock dance party thing,
Mm.
solely out of like pure perversion.
I think that's coming to Columbus too. It's got, I think I saw that on the marquee at our local
Yeah.
venue. So anyway, the
Oh yes.
question is the
Should I go?
nostalgia good or like, is it okay?
Yes. Yeah. Are we hitting a should we just let our memories be our memories, or is it good that now we're paying $40 to go see a band we might have paid $15 to see 25 years ago?
Well, I think it's cool in small doses. Like, Death Cab still tours a lot and they play a lot of new music. They continue to put out new music. And sure, like I think that there's an aspect of like the fans expect them to play the hits like any band. But it was cool for them to get to have a special, like play bigger venues and because they were celebrating a particular album, like, I wouldn't want every Death Cab tour to be like a Transatlanticism 20th anniversary tour, but it's special for them. And I think, like you were saying, like you didn't get to see it when you were young. Like I think about Neutral Milk Hotel when they did their reunion tour in 2014, 2013, 2014. It was like they had been away for so long and they had blown up, like the legend around them had ballooned so much in the time since they were an active band. Like the vast majority of their fans had never seen them live, and so it was cool to provide an opportunity for that to happen. But then they just kind of went away again, which I think is cool also. Like they didn't turn it into this like endless cash grab. And so I think every generation has like their nostalgia tours and there's some value to it. And I think if somebody was only going to see bands they liked 20, 25 years ago, that would be maybe kind of sad. But at the same time, like that's as someone who is continuing to engage with new music and thinks that there's exciting new music now. So I don't know, like I don't think it's bad for bands to do it, especially like Interpol. I feel like they've done multiple Turn on the Bright Lights anniversary tours already. Um, but I can't hold it against them. Like I know that probably they're probably able to charge more for the tickets and uh they on the band side it's like, they got to make a living. Um, and with Interpol, I don't really want to hear any of their material post Turn on the Bright Lights either. So bring on the nostalgia tour where they're concerned. But yeah, I wouldn't want all of my favorite bands from when I was in college to just be out there playing their classic albums all the time. Like I would like to think that I could still find new bands that I wanted to go see, and I would like to think that my old favorite bands would continue evolving and growing. But you got to be somewhat realistic with like human nature and what people want to hear.
Yeah, we don't want sticks, everyone to become sticks.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of nostalgia, Robert Morast has a question about MySpace.
Oh yeah, that's in the book.
Hey, and thanks for getting the pronunciation of my name correct. That's very rare, Grace. Um, or what's up, Grace? Sorry, I'm trying to work at the same time. My head is divided. I'm
It
on the
was
West Coast.
Alexandra.
Okay, thanks, Alexandra. Anyways, the question is, so I wonder what your thoughts are on MySpace kind of like blurring the lines of what the indie definition or aesthetic is. At least to my mind, it was probably the first like mainstream internet area that seemed to like secularize indie music and kind of put it in the same page where your grandma might visit.
Yeah.
Just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Oh, it definitely played a part. It played a part in exposing the music for sure. I mean, obviously, indie wasn't well, we'll talk about that in a second. It played a part in exposing the music, just putting it out there. It was such a music centric. It was the most popular social media site at the time. It was the first really big one because like Friendster preceded it, but it never got nearly as big as MySpace did. And music was so intertwined with MySpace. It's like you could set your profile to play a certain song, and bands had profiles where the songs were streaming, and so like yeah, music was just enmeshed in the social internet from the very beginning there. And so it was cool that MySpace was a place where bands could go viral or like build up an audience without a gatekeeper like boosting them. Like, and this is true of like Napster and file sharing before that, but it was a environment where like you didn't have to get fit into a radio format or like be selected by an MTV programmer. It's just like if enough people liked it, it would just catch on. And then you had kind of bands referring people to the other bands and their top eight and all that. So there's the social networking aspect. So yeah, I think that was huge for exposure, and I think it also contributed to sort of the stylistic evolution of indie and sort of like a more eclectic big tent of different types of artists being all shoehorned within the same ecosystem known as indie, because like it was a service that it contributed to that iPod effect of like, okay, well, I just have a little bit of everything. I listen to a little bit of everything now. MySpace helped facilitate that.
And sticking with the internet for a little bit longer, Michael Barclay also had a question about the role that the internet might have had in internationalizing indie rock
Mm.
or indie music.
Hello, Chris. I'm very excited your book exists and that you're writing about this time period. Um, I'm in Toronto and I grew up in Canada reading American publications, British publications, and of course, local stuff. But as a Canadian music fan, I was eternally frustrated by never seeing anything Canadian in the US press, except for our pop stars. Um, and I feel like the 2000s was the first time that the rest of the world paid attention to the cooler Canadians that I loved and my friends and neighbors, which is why I wrote a book about that. But
Yeah.
my question is, do you think that the accessibility of music on the internet through MySpace and through all these file sharing and everything else broke the hegemony of US, UK pop narratives? Not only Canada benefited, certainly Sweden benefited. Tons of Swedish bands broke through, your Peter Bjorn and Johns and Robins, etc. Phoenix from France. Like I felt like there was a leveling that happened, and I'm wondering if I've yet to read your book. I'm sorry to say I need to, um, but your book is primarily American. What effect do you think the internet had on globalizing that music for American audiences?
Yeah, I think that definitely played a part. I mean, like, it's interesting when you read Jesse Jarno's Yo La Tengo biography, you just like they talk a lot about like, we were American indie bands and like people were so these alternative radio playlists, they're so obsessed with Britain and so like there was just such a distinction between what was happening in the different countries in the 20th century. And then so yeah, when we're in this internet age, absolutely, it's like obliterating these borders. It's like, and there's some negative effect of that too. It's like contributed to the death of the local music scene as like I mean, they still exist obviously, but like for many different reasons. Keith, I talk about it, something that Keith Harris wrote in the book also, like where New York and Brooklyn, like during the internet era, became like sort of everyone's local music scene. Uh, and so like some of that had to do with media consolidation and like, local alt weeklies dying and stuff like that. So there wasn't as much coverage for what was going on in your own neck of the woods. And so everybody could just focus on like TV on the radio and Grizzly Bear as like America's local bands or whatever. But yeah, as far as, I mean, it certainly opened my ears to a lot of Canadian music in the early 2000s, the stuff that is covered in your book. Uh, I this was like this was my entry point, was early 2000s. And so it's kind of hard for me to imagine a music fandom where I wasn't hearing about artists from all over the world and kind of ex experiencing them on the same platform. Like it still felt like kind of like alluringly like exotic when I would hear about something that was happening in Sweden or even England. Like it still felt like it was from a world away, but I felt like, yeah, it was being equally platformed alongside the stuff that was happening in Chicago or Brooklyn. And so yeah, I mean, as someone who was living in like who grew up in suburban Columbus, Ohio, even the stuff that was happening in Chicago and Brooklyn seemed exotic to me. But yeah, this that's the long answer to your question. The short answer is I think absolutely there was a sort of the distinctions between these different parts of the world. The walls sort of came down, just like the walls came down between genres, the walls came down between different geographical distinctions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Chris Malamphy has a question about distinctions between indie and punk.
Hey,
Hey.
how's it going, Chris? Um, yeah, I was intrigued by the final discussion you guys were having. I think it was you and Grace about, you know, the definition of indie and the fact that indie as a term is so loaded with meaning tied back to its, shortening of the word independent. And I wanted to compare it to punk, which, we just had one of these sessions a couple weeks ago about punk. And, what fascinates me about punk is that, and this, everything I'm saying right now would get me kicked out of Gilman Street in the Bay Area. Um, punk is supposed to mean something, but the fact is, I've been saying this for decades, punk is a genre. We can describe what punk sounds like. You kind of know punk when you hear it. Whereas indie seems to be less freighted with that baggage, but it kind of became freighted with that baggage. So I don't know how much you've thought about what indie as a genre versus indie as a signifier versus punk as a genre and punk as a signifier.
Well, I mean, I think that indie in the 90s was a genre. Like, I think it became a genre. It started out certainly just indicated a business arrangement. Like, it was not, this is an independent record company. This music was released either without a record label or by an independent label. But I think that like by the time you have Sebadoh singing "Gimme Indie Rock," that like you're starting to have a little bit more of like an aesthetic consistency. Like I talk about this a little bit in the book, uh, and like relate it to the evolution of like rap music, also like conscious rap. It's like a lot of times when people talk about underground rap, what they really mean is like a certain type of like conscious rap, and they don't necessarily mean like early 3 6 Mafia that was technically independent. And so like I think indie, even though it still had it implied sort of a do-it-yourself quality, a independence from the mainstream machine or whatever. I do think that it was a genre, like, and I think the stuff that's on the playlist, the soundtrack for the first chapter of my book, is my attempt to kind of summarize, like, what was this genre before it started to, evolve in many different directions. But now it's tough because I think my distinction now is between indie and indie rock. Like I think about indie rock as like music that sounds like pavement. And I think about indie as a much more fluid term. And so maybe the term indie, sort of divorced from the word rock is the thing that has become so fluid and arguably meaningless. But I feel like indie rock, there's still kind of like a scrappy scraggly quality to it, and you can point to a certain artistic lineage that certainly sprung off of punk or exists in parallel with punk. But yeah, I think that I probably could have a whole other session talking about that. That's the short answer is, I guess the summary answer is, I feel like indie rock is an identifiable genre and indie maybe is not. And it's like part of the point of the book is sort of tracing how, this sort of this subcultural ecosystem that cultivated indie rock exploded out into this sort of lifestyle music that was indie. But yeah, it's a big complicated question, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you.
And I will pass things over to Matthew Bannister with our last question in the evening about indie and diversity.
Oh, hello, hi. Thank you, everybody. It's a really interesting discussion. Obviously, years ago, I wrote a book about indie and talked about how it was, to some degree, like the production of white guys.
Hmm.
And so I was interested in the question of how much has it changed? Is it more, ethnically or gender diverse now? And I'm thinking in terms of the commentary and the institutions as much as the musical personnel.
Yeah, I think that that was one of the things that was really driving, you know, there were commercial factors that were driving some of the changes in indie, but I think that there were really noble, there was a desire to diversify sort of within that world at the same time that like people were warming up to the idea of pop. It's like people were like kind of taking a look around and saying like we can't just have, a bunch of white guys with guitars. Like there's so much more to the world. And so I think that like the 2010s version of indie certainly diversified in terms of gender. It became arguably, more like women and like women, non-binary, queer artists. Like that became arguably the dominant force in indie by the late 2010s. Because I think people were really both the audience and like sort of the gatekeepers, the writers and critics, the record labels. I think everybody was really making an effort to not just be a bunch of white dudes, but the racial dynamic of it, I think, is it's still pretty white. Like it's not like there's no prominent like black indie artists, but it does still seem like when you see a black indie artist, it still feels like a little bit of an anomaly in terms of like maybe not that they exist, but when one really blows up and breaks through. Um, so I think that there's probably still a lot of work left to be done. And people who are more qualified than me to write about the subject of race have written some really interesting things about that subject. Uh, but I do think that that was one of the reasons why indie as a music became more sonically diverse and eclectic and sort of branched off in many different directions was because people were trying to engage with cultures outside of this sort of like insular, scrappy, noisy, white guys with guitars type music. Um, and it's so yeah, I think that that is a great question, and it's one that I really wanted to tackle a little bit more in the book than I did. Um, but it's a huge part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I would sort of agree in the sense that I think if you look at Flying Nun Records in New Zealand, for example, many of its major artists now are actually solo women in the newer artists like Aldous Harding or Tiny Ruins or Vera Ellen. So it seems like there's been a shift there too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to Grace and Chris and Grace for a great conversation. Join us next Wednesday on January 14th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation about Bad Bunny. Vanessa Diaz and Petra Rivera-Rideau will be in conversation with Anna Marie Sayer about their forthcoming anthology, P fucking R? P fucking R. How Bad Bunny became the global voice of Puerto Rican resistance. See you then. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Night.
Thanks, everybody.